everyone. Welcome to today's episode on our Decisions Now podcast. We are actually extra excited about today's podcast because we have Evalueserve's co-founder with us, Marc Vollenweider. And then we're also, of course, joined by Evalueserve's CTO, Rigvi Chevala. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, Erin. Hi there.
Cool. So I think we have some really cool topics for today. We had been talking about a lot of this stuff, but it's super relevant. And in fact, I was actually on a call yesterday where a lot of these topics were brought up. It's just everyone's talking about it right now. So looking at what are the logistics of getting analytics to decision makers, I think there's a lot of pieces that go into that. It's not... No one wants data just for the sake of data. They don't want information for the sake of information. They're not going to use it. Everyone's busy. So part of this is getting information in the right format at the right time. So Marc and Rigvi, you both experienced this quite a bit within Evalueserve. So what are some of the ways that you're looking at this?
Let me start first, Rigvi, and then you jump in. So what we see in our client base is essentially the challenge of getting from data to the decision making and the actions. Right? What this usually entails is doing the analytics, obviously, right? Getting the data right, doing smart analytics, having some good use cases for it. But then once this is done, usually this sits somewhere with some central team, some data analytics team. And from there, it needs to reach the decision makers in time, in the right format. Just a very practical challenge I see personally is when I get a lot of financial information from our finance department, I just don't have the time in the day to study all of it, right? So I would like to have some concise insights, for example, a deviation analysis with some so what's attached. What do I need to do? I would like it to be prepared already so that for decision making, I'm ready to take a decision and then afterwards execute an action. So this challenge from getting the analytics to the end user, the decision maker, that's really challenging for many of our clients.
Marc, I think you actually said something really on point that really resonates with me too, but it's especially when you get information that it doesn't excite you. So for me, if I was getting a lot of financial information, that is not an area that I gravitate towards quite naturally. So when I do receive something like that, I really do need somebody to tell me, this is what you need to look at. I don't want to pull up a big Excel, a big PowerPoint, and just open it and just close it right away because it's just overwhelming. So really understanding what are the things that I need to know and what are the things that you need me to respond with as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, boiling it down to, like Marc said, all of that information coming down, and it ultimately comes down to, okay, what do I do now, right? So what or what ifs the people ask questions around. And that's, as simple as it sounds, to get to that stage, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background. And I think that's where decision making with data nowadays requires a bunch of data scientists, a bunch of analysts, everyone behind the scenes that know that subject before a decision's taken.
Also, one point I would like to mention, not every decision maker works in the same way, right? Some of the people who are, sort of very left brained, I'm sort of guilty of being a nerd myself. We look at a data table and then we see patterns. Okay. Now, not everybody works like that. And some people want to be told stories, insightful stories. And so I tend to think of data analytics and how it gets to the decision maker almost like in 3 or 4 levels. Level 1 is like sheer data. Actually, no, not even information. It's just data. Then one converts it to something I would call information, which is, for example, financial data. And then from there, it's a big step towards insights. Drawing the conclusions from the data, from the information, and that I would call insight. And then lots of insights together, that is knowledge. So a typical decision maker needs insights, usually, and then for the background, they need knowledge, the summary, the sort of high-level synthesis of all of it. Now, how do you get the insight to the right person? That's a very tricky piece of work, because everybody works differently. Everybody wants to have the story presented to them in different ways. Some people want it at 7:30 in the morning before they even go to office. They want a quick statement, a quick message, maybe on WhatsApp or Signal or whatever, maybe with a link attached if they're interested in doing some more. Other people want this to be spelled out to them in text, and some other people just want the hard facts, the data, and they're happy with it. So understanding the end user is critical in this.
So I love that. I was actually just recently doing some pricing analytics stuff, and I think that concept is actually, when you use data analytics and pricing, the example becomes so clear, because when you are doing things, in particular, it's always easier to give a B2C example, but when you have AI that's really tracking who are your consumers, when are they buying, what are they buying, what's the max price, who are the competitors they're looking at, tracking all of that in real time, and then being able to launch a campaign that sends them an ad or launches their Google ad so they actually click on it. It has the right wording, the right offer, it has the right timing, and it also has the maximum price that they're likely to pay, or it shows them a discount. So it just like it understands what their behavior is in order for you to do that. Similar if there was if Twitter started trending on something and you could track their behavior and you would just know, I need to launch a campaign that's going to sell this stuff because it's going to be so popular right away. Data analytics can take that kind of thing and it can create all of these campaigns and really improve the results that you're getting. And it can do it in real time to the scale that a human would never be able to do that. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting ways that this is actually getting applied today.
Oh yeah. In fact, a B2B example, or I guess it's a B2C in this case. I was shopping for home warranty, and looks like they use some sort of behavioral analytics, right? Because after I abandoned my cart, a couple of days later they said, "Hey, we'll give you a $75 off," and then I just ignored that. And then a couple more days later they said, "I'll give you $100 off," and now it's $125 this week. So they're looking at what barrier these customers fall into and then just, push those campaigns. So it's also these graduated campaigns that are scientifically backed.
Yeah, and on the B2B side, I would like to add an example from our client base. It's a logistics company in the US, tons of trucks driving, crisscrossing the United States. They have about 200 service centers in the US. And the managers of these service centers need to know pretty well in advance, about 14 days in advance, what kind of service volumes they can expect on any given day by type of service. So there, the challenge is that every one of these service center managers needs a forecast, which is a rolling forecast 14 days out. And then they can adjust their staffing levels and they can adjust all other sorts of logistical topics that they need to go through in order to handle this well for the clients. Now, there the challenge is that these service center managers, they're constantly overwhelmed. They are so busy with everything they have to do. They just cannot spend too much time on reading stuff. So therefore, it's very critical that these analytics that we produce on a rolling basis get to their device they're using on the handheld. They're using every day they're working, they have this handheld, and we need to push these analytics straight to their handheld. And it's only what I would call the minimum data that they need to have, but it's the maximum they can handle. So there's not much, right? It's just a few parameters that tells them 14 days out, so much work. This translates into how many people you need to have on that day. So delivering it to them at the right time, in the right format, and in this case, it's minimalistic, right? It's the minimum possible that you need to deliver. That's the only way they can digest it and then really make decisions based on it.
I think that actually goes back to what you were saying with the story piece earlier, is that, again, you need to have it in a digestible format, and people, like, stories resonate with people as well. How are you actually seeing people solving for this? Like, there's a lot of data scientists, statisticians that create the data, they interpret the data, but they also don't know how to share that story to make it relatable to other people. So do you see people taking a certain approach, or maybe is there a new role that you see emerging or an open area in the market?
Yes, we do. In fact, it's a logistical challenge. I just give you one example, which is competitive intelligence and insights on competitive intelligence. You can also call it for innovation tracking, disruption tracking, whatever. So when you serve a company with lots of divisions and lots of division managers and maybe heads of strategy, heads of marketing, every one of them has their own perspective, what is relevant to them on that day. So it's not good enough to just deliver something to someone and it's the same for everybody who goes onto that platform. It needs to be adjusted to the individual needs of these particular division heads for their division, because their competitors are likely to be different from the other division's competitors, right? So therefore, there needs to be a platform that handles all of these logistics automatically, because doing this manually is typically where people fail. They have good intentions, do a lot of analytics, and there's a central team with lots of very smart analysts, but then they fail in terms of distributing this to the right people at the right time, and also automatically figuring out what these people want, how they want these issues to be tracked, which issues to be tracked, the mind map. And so I think there's a market potential for such platforms that handle these logistics. Also, and that's, I think, very important, it's not good enough to just push some information to someone or some insight. You also want this to be a community so people can start discussing. So building social capabilities into such platforms is also critically important for the adoption of such platforms. Rigvi, maybe over to you if you might have some additional thoughts there.
No, I think the last point you just mentioned, right, the social aspect, if, again, kind of relating to a B2C, if I'm trying to buy a product, I would like to see what others think, right? And in a similar way, when there's some of these insights that are being provided, I'd like to collaborate with others and say, hey, kind of, what do you think of this? Like, get that opinion and get that social element at the same time when you're ingesting that information. To your point, it's not just about the math that's behind it, or the synthesis, but it's also that second layer of validation that you seek in general.
Rigvi, a question to you. I mean, you're building this stuff,
Sure.
right? You're building all these platforms because you're the CTO. So what is the biggest challenge for you when you get these requests from the lines of business? I mean, what do you do?
Actually, it touches on a point you mentioned earlier, and that to me is one of the very key challenges anyone needs to solve, not just us. Is understand that set of user personas, because you mentioned where, there are folks that are either afraid of math or data. There are folks that actually want to see data, right? And how do you kind of merge that user experience, and make it configurable enough, right? That multiple such user personas can still take that decision. So the challenge that I see, when we're building these is all these different personalities we need to cater to and make it more effective. So the user experience of that, of showing those insights and making them take a decision comfortably and confidently, that is the biggest challenge, because the technology, we've solved for that. I mean, that's the easy part, relatively speaking. It's how you put it in front of the users. That's the trickiest part, because that's where your human emotions or EQ comes in, right? And to me, that's been the biggest challenge for us, is to get that kind of feedback and incorporate that and make it right. Even big companies like Google and Facebook still have UX issues. And that's because you just cater to a lot more people, right, in those organizations.
That's actually very interesting, because recently I was asked by someone, what's the ideal team for analytics? And then they were sort of talking about their mathematicians and statisticians that they have in the company. And then I sort of ask, okay, I get that, but there might be other skill sets that they should probably add to their teams. And when I think about analytics, it's usually a composition of multiple skill sets that are very hard to combine in one single individual. One is clearly the analytics and the statistics and the data science. That's clearly one specific skill. But then I think, especially on the UX side, there is room for somebody who's more like a UX specialist or a behavioral scientist, because these people need to understand the psychology of people and how they work, how they make decisions, how they implement, and how they check on their decisions. And that is far more sort of a right brain side of activity. And therefore, finding skill sets or people who can handle that is very critical, and they need to be part of the analytics team. And then obviously the data side of things and the IT side of things, I mean, that's clear by now, but still, I think people underestimate the need, for example, for data architecture, because what we encounter very often is that people have some data scientists and maybe some IT people, but very few people understand the data architectural issues of things. So if I had to sort of summarize the key additions to normal sort of conventional teams in data analytics, then it is the behavioral scientist for the software side of things and the data architecture side of things for building proper use cases.
I think that brings up a challenge, though, because when you pair these two, like the left brain and the right brain people together, you still get there's a cultural element that you have to bring into it also. So you're going to have some clashing that occurs when you're actually building out these products, you're building out these tools, or it's on the actual side of the decision makers. They are used to using their instincts and they're very proud of being able to make all these decisions that they've done throughout their entire life just based on instinct, based on experience. And in some cases, they don't think that they need this data. So where do you guys see that cultural element fitting into all of this?
Yeah, I mean, what we see on the client side is a very varied picture. Clearly, there is almost, in some cases, there's almost some allergic reaction to data. I call this the data analytics allergy. Not sure whether it's curable or not. But clearly some people are less used to working with hard facts and data, and they default more towards the gut feel side of things. On the other side, there are some people who are maybe a little too much on the left brain side and too much on the data side, and then everything needs to be overanalyzed and everything needs to be backed by data, which is sometimes simply not possible because there is no data or because the relevance of the data is just simply not there. So there's probably an optimum in between, which is a balance between sort of real hard analytics with data and then gut feel based on entrepreneurial instinct, for example. And so I guess where this leaves us is that both parties, the left brain and the right brain, somehow need to acknowledge that there's value to the other side. And the balance is probably somewhere in between. Now, it's probably hard to find, but we see that some people are a little bit too much on one side, and some people are a little bit too much on the other side. So the balance might be the right thing.
Absolutely. And in fact, any decisions that you typically see that are being made, and as an external party or an observer, you'd say, why did they make that call? And you just don't know if that decision maker leveraged data and still combine that with gut feel, or was it just data? Or because what you see is the output of that, right, or the outcome of that decision. So to your point, I think even either way you go, like wherever you are on the spectrum, decisions can still be made incorrectly. So that's the common denominator, right? But I think what we're trying to help here, at least in the B2B world, is to reduce those chances of making the wrong decision. I think that's where that balance, I can't, as you were talking, I was thinking about the Kansas City Chiefs game that happened last Sunday. They had a chance. Andy Reid could have made the call before the first half. He had data, right? They said, do these play calls, but he went with his gut. The outcome was they lost, but, people only see that, but he actually had the data and he made a gut choice, right? And to me, that's the right way to make a decision. And he used his experience or whatever, right? But then, you just see the outcome and say, well, that was a bad call. So to me, I think I think that psychological fear of getting judged at the end of the outcome is what kind of travels back, and that's why people pick one or the other. And the balance is important.
I think that's a very deep point that we could maybe take a step further, actually. When you think through the trust that people have in decision engines or decision support, right? I think it is important that they still keep a certain amount of, sort of distance from it. They understand what the limitations are of the decision engine that they have below. Because in some cases, when a machine doesn't understand the context that it has been built for, then in all likelihood, the conclusions from an engine are going to be wrong. So therefore, a leader needs to understand where the limitations are of the analytics, of the use case they have. And so I think the future generation of leaders needs to not just understand analytics, but particularly understand where the context, where they're leaving the context, the engine can handle. And therefore, they need to have sort of this built-in, I wouldn't say distrust, but sort of control that they always think through, well, is this machine actually built to answer this question in this particular context, or has the context changed? Just to give you a B2B example, in banks, there are lots of pricing mechanisms, for example, for option pricing, securities pricing. So now the people who built these models, 2 years, 3 years after they've built these models, are likely to have left the bank. Therefore, you have an algorithm that is running underneath, and maybe in the meantime, the context has totally changed. So therefore, the trading recommendations by that algorithm might be totally off. If this algorithm runs once, well, it's not a big problem. If it runs 10 times, maybe not a big problem. But if it runs a few million times per year, big problem. So therefore, understanding whether the context has changed is critical. And I think, especially in the times of AI, we really need to make sure that there are sort of sensible mechanisms built into this that challenge whether the algorithm is still valid or not.
Exactly. And I think that's what people have termed as explainable AI, since you brought up that, is, because there's really no trust or understanding, forget trust, of what that algorithm's doing, right? To your point, if people leave, it's just sitting there, it's just a machine algo that's running, and no one knows what decisions it's taking, right? So the whole advent of explainable AI and auditable AI, whatever the term is to first build that trust. And then two, if the context changes, like you mentioned, it's wrong, right? So you go fix it. Like otherwise you wouldn't know, right? So it also eliminates that unconscious bias within these algorithms.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of people, when you talk about technology, you talk a lot about how it removes bias, but the reality is the data is going to put in whatever bias is whatever context it learned off of. So I think there's countless number of examples of if you're looking at crime in certain areas, if it starts to see there's a lot of crime in this area, it's going to start predicting more crime in that area, and it's just going to learn from that data set. So there's at least in the UK a couple years ago, there was a lot going on about the right for explanation in terms of how is your AI algorithm actually created, especially if that's going to be the only thing that's going to be making the decision. So do people actually have a right to then go back and say, if AI made this decision, I want to appeal it, understand what data actually created this, and then I guess have a take two at it, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, if you extend this to the B2B environment, as we discussed before, senior managers want to see insights, right? And not just information. So what we see is that the AI algorithms work very well at the data level, converting data into information, and then to some extent at the information level, converting them potentially into insights. But we still see the need to have some of this curated by some humans for the higher level insights, the higher level cognitive conclusions. Because otherwise, there might be a dependency which is too big, just focusing on the data, and then the algorithms might produce something where actually, the context goes lost. And so I think having something which we call AI-assisted analysts is probably sort of, again, a balanced mix, making sure that there's curated content coming out at the end, so containing the full context.
Absolutely. AI-guided analysts and domain-specific AI. I think that's the key. Like, the context is important, but then the gut feel and the human touch is also important.
Seems to be the best of both worlds there.
Yeah.
All right, Marc, I am going to ask you one final question, and I'm going to end it on a fun note. So we're going to go in a different direction here. You go to Jamaica pretty much every year. And so I'm curious, out of all the times you've been, what is your favorite memory from your Jamaica trips?
The favorite memory is definitely, you need to give the context as well. Otherwise, I look like as if I didn't do any work. It's actually our Founders Club or President's Club, where we invite, the most successful people in the company and their spouses. So that's why the most memorable experience is always to be together with everybody, and then drinking some rum punch, on the beach, in the house. That's obviously most memorable, and we enjoy that. We enjoy that thoroughly.
Fantastic. We'll have to get our rum punch recipes from you. All right, Marc, it was great having you. Really enjoyed the conversation today.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.